Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over the most popular variations in the Queen's Gambit. So many people interested not only in chess these days, but in the Queen's Gambit opening, which starts out with d4, d5, and c4. So I thought it'd be a good video to go over the main variations that you'll see that Black can actually play after White plays c4. I do have in-depth videos on all of the variations I'm going to cover. So if you ever want to check those out, you can head over to thechesswebsite.com and check those out. I'll also have a link in the description below to my website. But there's really four main variations that you'll see from Black in the Queen's Gambit. There's two others that we'll discuss if you're trying to catch your opponent off guard. But the first and most popular defense in the Queen's Gambit is for Black to play c6. This is the Slav defense. This is not taking the pawn here on c4. That's the accepted line. But to defend this central pawn here on d5, White's really looking to give up material here on c4 so that White now has the two central pawns. Black only has one central pawn here on the e file, has given up his central pawn to gain that material here. And the Slav defense says that's not what we're looking to try to do. We want to play c6, solidify this pawn chain right here, and protect the central pawn here on d5. Most common line for White's going to be to continue with knight to f3. Black plays knight to f6. And then White has a couple options. If White plays e3, then Black can play bishop to g4. And this is the main Slav line. You could also get into the semi-Slav line, which is e6. This is blocking the light square bishop, but solidifying the pawn chain right here. It can become difficult for the light square bishop to come outside this pawn chain once this pawn here is on e6. So some people kind of have a preference if they play the Slav or the semi-Slav. The other defense for Black that's just as popular as the Slav defense is the Queen's Gambit orthodox line, and that is with e6. Solidifying the pawn here on d5, also preparing for the dark square bishop to come outside and attack the king. Prepare for a quick castle on the king side. Play normally resumes with knight to c3, knight to f6, bishop down to g5, pinning down the knight to the queen, getting the bishop outside the pawn chain before White plays pawn to e3. And you could see bishop to e7, stopping the pin, e3, and then castle on the king side. But Black has options to be tricky. Instead of bishop to e7, could always play knight to d7, getting into the elephant trap, which there's another video I've done on that trap. You could definitely check that out on the website, but I'll go through it real quick. Pawn takes here on d5. Pawn recaptures on d5. White takes on d5, and it looks like, why would Black ever take this knight? He's going to lose his queen. Doesn't matter. That's exactly what happens. After the bishop takes here, bishop to b4, and you can see check, and the only way to not lose the game is to play queen to d2. So after the bishop takes, king to d2, king takes here on d8, and Black is up a ton of material. Coming in at the third most popular variation is the accepted line, and that's if Black takes here on c4. Now, the Queen's Gambit, not your typical gambit. Black's going to gain material here on c4, but White can always get that material back. Black usually will just give the material on c4 back pretty quickly, because if Black does not, they're really going to ruin their entire position trying to hold on to that pawn. So play will typically resume with knight to f3. You could see knight to f6, pawn here to e3, preparing for the bishop to come and take here on c4, get that material back here. Pawn e6, bishop takes here on c4, and then pawn c5. Since White has the two pawns in the center of the board, Black only has one. Black using that c pawn, which White early on used their c pawn to kind of attack the center of the board. That's exactly what Black does here, and you can see the bishop on f8 is protecting this pawn. So if there ever was an exchange, the bishop could take that with tempo. Now, they don't have to play knight to f3. They could just play something like e3 right away. So if they just wanted to capture that material on the next move, they absolutely could. There's 4 main variations that you'll see in the Queen's Gambit. The fourth one we're going to be looking at, not as popular as the other 3, but definitely still will see it played, and that is the Albin counter Gambit, and that is E5 here. Now, I'm going to make a reference to the Netflix series, The Queen's Gambit. If you haven't seen that, I definitely don't want to spoil anything for you. I'd recommend skipping forward about 2 minutes in this video. That should make sure you don't catch any spoilers. But in the very last game in that series, you have Beth Harmon playing Borgov for the World Championship. Beth Harmon starts out with the Queen's Gambit here, and Borgov usually plays pretty straightforward lines, plays the move E5, plays the Albin counter Gambit. Now, you hear that said in the series, and so this should give you a better idea of what was actually played. Now, the Albin counter Gambit is pretty tricky. After the pawn takes on E5, which is undefended, black plays the move D4. This is a central wedge, keeping these pawns away from each other here, and it's difficult for white to deal with. The white's normally wanting to play moves like knight to C3, which they can't do, and so black has a lot of threats that white has to deal with. You could play the Lasker trap, so maybe they try to play E3. Since they already have a central pawn here on the E file, they could try to just chip away at this pawn, but then things like bishop to B4 are tricky. They can't play knight to C3 as we talked about, so bishop to D2, and you get into this weird trap where check, and then they can't take the pawn because you could just take their queen, and if they play E2, you could just under promote to a knight here, and things get pretty tricky. There's another video I've done on the Lasker trap. All in all, definitely not where white would want to be. They just have to be aware of those things. Now, the main line, instead of pawn to E3, is going to just be knight to F3, knight to C6. So even as you're watching that last match, you can start to see how this shapes up. So when you see the board, you'll see, oh, okay, I understand how they got there. There are 2 more variations that you'll see from time to time. They're both the Chigorin as well as the Baltic. Neither of these see a ton of play, and most times people will use them as a surprise attack because the Queen's Gambit is so popular for white. The Chigorin defense is knight to C6, and then you have the Baltic, which is bishop here to F5. Not going to go too much into the theory on either of these. I do have a video on both of those openings on the website. Definitely check those out if you want to, but hopefully you enjoyed this video going over the main variations. Hopefully, if you haven't spent too much time on the Queen's Gambit, this gives you a better understanding of the options that black has if they're ever met with the Queen's Gambit from white. If you haven't already, please hit the like button. Definitely helps support the channel. Let me know what your favorite variation in the Queen's Gambit is below. Thank you guys so much for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.